What began as a quiet royal gathering inside Windsor Castle erupted into a moment no one expected. Princess Anne, the most unflinching voice of duty, locked eyes with Queen Camilla and accused her of hiding what could be the most explosive royal documents in decades. The atmosphere inside those walls, often weighed down by formality, suddenly cracked under the weight of accusation. Anne did not arrive as a sister, nor as a mere senior royal. She came as the guardian of her mother's legacy, determined to confront what others had been whispering in secrecy. Anne's unexpected arrival sent ripples through the halls. Whispers had already begun among the staff that something had gone missing from Windsor's private archives, but no one dared voice them in front of the Queen Consort. Yet Anne, carrying an almost militant sense of purpose, wasted no time. She walked into that room not as a guest, but as an accuser, her words slicing through the silence with the force of undeniable suspicion. Those present later recalled that moment with one phrase: "The temperature of Windsor dropped." The tension escalated as Anne addressed Camilla directly. No ceremony, no pleasantries, only an accusation so sharp it stunned those within earshot. Rumors had reached her ears, and they all pointed toward the same source. Documents tied to the late Queen Elizabeth's private decrees and historical letters had vanished without explanation. Anne's voice, steady but unyielding, made it clear this was not gossip. This was a matter that cut into the very bone of royal history. She told Camilla these weren't simply papers or records, they were the monarchy's living memory, proof of its continuity, its truth, its unbroken chain. To see them gone was to see the crown's foundation itself undermined. Camilla's reaction was swift, but far from convincing. At first, shock spread across her face, and then came a denial wrapped in disbelief. Yet, her hesitation, the slight pause before her defense, only added fuel to Anne's fire. The princess had not come unprepared, and Camilla's startled demeanor gave her all the confirmation she needed. In that instant, the confrontation stopped being a private exchange between two women and became a cold, fiery battle of power that those who witnessed it would never forget. Anne's determination radiated through every word. She spoke as though Elizabeth herself stood behind her, urging her forward, reminding her that history erased is history betrayed. For Anne, the documents were not relics. They were her mother's voice, her family's testimony, her nation's record. Without them, what truth remained unspoken? Without them, whose version of history would dominate? The silence that followed was not peace, but suffocation. Aides, guards, and attendants all looked away, terrified to meet the eyes of either woman. They knew this was not a quarrel to be ignored or forgotten. It was a fracture in the crown, an open wound between two of the most powerful figures within the monarchy. For Anne, there was no room left for diplomacy, and for Camilla, denial would never erase the shadows cast by Anne's relentless accusations. But what exactly were these missing documents, and why would Camilla be the one accused of hiding them? Some say the disappearance of these documents was no accident. It was the result of a deliberate plan, and the timing could not be more damning. Within the walls of Windsor, whispers began to spread like wildfire, that the loss of these papers was not a careless mistake, but a carefully orchestrated move. What vanished was not trivial. It was the very essence of royal continuity, pieces of history that carried the voice of the late Queen Elizabeth and the shadow of her intentions. The mystery did not lie in their worth, but in their sudden absence, an absence too sharp, too precise, to be ignored. The archive at Windsor had always been a fortress of memory, a place where the monarchy's secrets were preserved against time itself. Yet, in recent weeks, rumors grew that certain volumes and files had slipped away from their shelves, leaving behind nothing but hollow spaces where history once lived. Among them were records tied to Elizabeth's most private letters and her sealed decrees documents that could have altered the perception of her reign and cast a long light onto the future of the crown. These were not ceremonial trinkets, they were testimonies, truths written in her own hand, and they were gone. Questions mounted when palace staff quietly admitted they had seen movement in the archives at night. Boxes, once secured, had been carried away in silence. No official orders had been given. No authorization had been signed. Yet, the trail pointed to something more troubling. Connections to Camilla's circle. The Queen Consort's family, it was said, had been seen near restricted corridors, access granted in ways no outsider should have received. The whispers painted a picture of intrusion, of influence, stretching into places that should have remained untouchable. Was it coincidence? Or the opening moves of a calculated game? What lay at the heart of suspicion were not only the documents themselves, but the timing of their disappearance. They vanished at a moment when questions of succession were at their most sensitive. Within the missing pages were hints suggesting that Elizabeth may have envisioned Catherine as more than a consort, as a figure carrying her legacy into the new century. If those decrees had survived, they would have fortified Catherine's position beyond dispute, elevating her to a role beyond Camilla's reach. Stripped away, they left uncertainty, and in uncertainty, Camilla's presence at Charles's side gained strength. Was it possible, then, that the documents had been taken not simply for protection, but to erase Elizabeth's voice in favor of another? For Anne, the threads of suspicion tightened, until they pointed directly at one conclusion: Camilla's family. She reportedly traced the loss through names, movements, and access records, all circling back to those closest to the Queen Consort. And in doing so, Anne realized she was no longer dealing with rumors, but with the outlines of betrayal. This was not merely about a locked cabinet or a misplaced box of files. It was about the reshaping of history itself, and about who held the power to silence voices no longer alive to defend themselves. The stakes became clear. This wasn't just a family quarrel. It was a direct challenge to the very survival of royal history. To understand Anne's fury, we must look back at a private oath she once whispered at her mother's side, vowing to protect the monarchy's truth at all costs. For Anne, her bond with Elizabeth was unlike that of any other child. She was not simply a daughter, but a confidant, the one Elizabeth trusted when silence mattered more than ceremony. While others basked in the glow of public admiration, Anne stood in the shadows of duty, her mother's most steadfast protector. That devotion became her identity, forged not in grandeur, but in loyalty that never wavered. It was during one of their final conversations that Elizabeth laid bare her deepest fears. She reminded Anne that crowns may be inherited, but truth is what sustains the crown. "Truth is the spine of the monarchy," the Queen reportedly said, her words etched into Anne's memory like scripture. From that moment, Anne carried the burden of those words as a commandment. The archive of history was not merely paper and ink, it was the monarchy's conscience, and if that conscience was altered or erased, then the entire house would crumble upon lies. This vow became Anne's personal mission, one that drew strength from her military training and unyielding sense of discipline. Her life had been one of service, of putting the institution above herself. But this was different. This was not about pageantry or protocol. It was about guarding the truth that defined her family's survival. For Anne, every document stolen, every decree silenced, felt like an attack on her mother's voice from beyond the grave. It was not history disappearing, it was Elizabeth herself being erased. And so, the emotional weight pressed heavily upon her. In the quiet hours, Anne could not shake the fear that she had failed. If the documents were gone, she had broken the very oath that defined her existence. It was a wound deeper than betrayal, one that cut into her very identity as Elizabeth's daughter and guardian. To Anne, allowing history to vanish was not a simple mistake. It was a crime against her mother's trust, a crime against the crown, and a crime against herself. This is why her confrontation with Camilla was not born of petty jealousy or rivalry. It was born from the sacred duty she believed had been handed to her directly by Elizabeth. Anne did not raise her voice simply to challenge a queen consort. She raised it because her mother's last wishes hung in the balance, and she would rather shatter the palace walls than remain silent. The weight of that oath was heavier than tradition, heavier than politics, heavier even than the bond of family. But what did these documents contain that could spark such a storm between two of the most powerful women in the monarchy? Buried deep in the archives were whispers of letters, sealed decrees, and notes that could expose royal alliances and betrayals. Their absence left one haunting question: who wanted them gone? The archives of Windsor were not simply shelves of history. They were vaults of memory, each page carrying the weight of choices, alliances, and secrets that had defined the monarchy for generations. To see them missing was to feel a fracture in the spine of tradition itself, a silence where voices of the past were meant to speak. And the whispers of what those pages contained were enough to shake the palace to its core. Among the missing files were private letters exchanged between Elizabeth, Diana, and Philip. These were no ceremonial pleasantries, but deeply personal words, written in moments of truth and vulnerability. Elizabeth's thoughts on her children's marriages, Diana's anguish over her treatment, Philip's stern warnings about preserving discipline within the house, all bound together in correspondence that, if exposed, could unravel carefully built facades. To lose them meant losing the most intimate evidence of the crown's inner struggles, and to find them in the wrong hands meant scandal on a scale the monarchy could not contain. More dangerous still was the whispered existence of a sealed decree, drafted long before Charles ever took the throne. This decree hinted at Catherine's future role, one that carried Elizabeth's blessing in ways that could overshadow Camilla's position. It suggested that Elizabeth had quietly recognized Catherine not only as William's partner, but as the monarchy's most vital anchor in the decades ahead. If revealed, this decree would confirm what many already suspected, that Elizabeth had foreseen a future where Catherine, not Camilla, was the true bearer of the crown's dignity. Its disappearance was no coincidence, and its absence spoke volumes about who stood to gain. But that was not all. References were said to exist within the archives, tying Camilla's family to questionable financial dealings. Hushed accounts of funds, properties, and influence tied into royal circles appeared in drafts that never saw the light of day. These were not proven scandals, but even the suggestion was enough to corrode legitimacy. If those records ever surfaced, Camilla's position would not just be weakened, it would be dismantled, leaving her vulnerable in a way that titles and ceremonies could never shield. Equally troubling was the vanishing of a memorandum tied to royal succession. This memorandum, it was said, carried not only clarifications about future heirs, but also private conversations on whether Harry and his children should retain their standing. Its absence was not just a loss of paperwork, it was the erasure of decisions that could determine the very line of kings and queens to come. Without it, history could be rewritten in silence, leaving heirs either bolstered or erased by manipulation. What tied all of this together was the stark reality that these documents were not paper, they were power. They represented leverage, truth, and legacy. To control them was to control the monarchy's story, to bend history in one's favor, to silence voices that had spoken long before today's disputes. Their disappearance was not an accident, it was an act of warfare, hidden beneath the quiet corridors of Windsor. The more Anne pushed, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about history, it was about control of the monarchy's future. Camilla, never one to bow easily, lashed back. In that charged moment, her defense turned into something even darker, a suggestion that Anne herself had something to hide. What began as a confrontation quickly shifted into a duel of words that cut deeper than the gilded walls could contain. Camilla's voice, sharp and unrelenting, accused Anne of manufacturing drama, of stirring chaos, not for the sake of truth, but for influence, for power. To Camilla, Anne was no guardian of history. She was a rival seeking to pull the throne's spotlight away from the queen consort and toward herself. Anne stood her ground, but Camilla pressed harder, wielding accusations with venom. She hinted at Anne's own private letters, letters that had never seen the light of day. Letters that, if released, might reveal truths about Anne's dealings, her judgments, and her criticisms of the family she claimed to protect. It was a veiled threat, but one that struck deep, because everyone knew that secrets were currency in the royal world. For the first time in that standoff, Anne felt the sting of Camilla's calculated retaliation. The clash escalated, voices rising above the hush of the palace walls until they became impossible to ignore. What had begun as a private confrontation spilled into something raw, something close to an open shouting match between two women who both believed they held the monarchy's survival in their hands. Camilla's denial of wrongdoing was loud, unyielding, but carefully constructed. She did not offer clarity on the missing documents. She offered no explanation for the gaps in her staff's movements, no reassurance that her family's proximity to the archives was innocent. She simply deflected, twisting the focus onto Anne's supposed flaws, hoping to turn suspicion away from herself. Anne, however, was not one to cower in the face of deflection. Her fury grew, not just at Camilla's refusal to answer directly, but at the gall of her counterattacks. The princess's words, cold and resolute, cut through the queen consort's evasions like a blade. She made it clear that her loyalty was to her mother's legacy, not to the fragile pride of a woman she believed had overstepped her place. And the more Camilla spat back, the more Anne's conviction hardened, transforming the argument into a battle neither could afford to lose. What unfolded was more than a dispute. It was a symbolic power struggle between two queens of Windsor, one by birth, one by marriage. Each represented a different vision of the monarchy, each determined to claim its truth. For Anne, this was about honor and duty. For Camilla, It was about survival and legitimacy. Neither would yield, and in that collision, the monarchy itself trembled. But the truth would not remain in the shadows for long, because others within the palace had begun to take sides. When word reached William and Catherine, they realized this wasn't just Anne versus Camilla. This was about the future their children would inherit. The weight of the missing documents now pressed against them as heavily as it did against Anne. Because within those sealed letters and decrees lay the potential to either protect or endanger the next generation of heirs. What had begun as a confrontation within Windsor's walls was no longer confined to two women. It had become a storm, threatening to sweep through the entire House of Windsor. For William, the conflict struck at the heart of his identity. His loyalty to his aunt was undeniable. Anne had stood beside him during some of the darkest years of his life, offering a steadiness few others could provide. Yet Camilla was now the queen consort, the partner of his father, and protocol demanded deference to her station. To choose sides openly would be to fracture the delicate balance that held the monarchy together, but silence weighed on him like betrayal. Every move, every word, threatened to pit his private loyalties against the rules of royal hierarchy. Catherine, however, carried no such hesitation. Quietly but firmly, she aligned herself with Anne. Deep in her heart, she knew Diana's memory could be buried in those missing papers. The possibility that her late mother-in-law's words, thoughts, and warnings were among the stolen documents filled her with both fear and fury. Catherine's instincts told her this was more than an archival loss. This was an intentional silencing of voices that spoke directly to her family's destiny. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, what it meant for history to be twisted, rewritten, or erased. Her fears only deepened when she considered George and Charlotte. Their future legitimacy, their rightful place in the royal lineage, might be undermined if records tied to succession had vanished. For Catherine, the missing documents weren't abstract pieces of history. They were shields meant to protect her children from the storms of doubt that already swirled around the monarchy. Without them, George and Charlotte could face a future where their inheritance was questioned, their place challenged, their bloodline contested by whispers stronger than truth. Catherine's resolve drew from Diana herself. She remembered the private stories, the warnings Diana had shared before her passing, about letters that could be hidden, testimonies that could be buried, truths deliberately locked away to protect the powerful. It felt as though Diana's ghost was speaking through Anne's defiance, reminding Catherine that the crown was as fragile as it was heavy, and that silence in the face of deception was the most dangerous betrayal of all. William, meanwhile, grew increasingly frustrated at Charles's silence. His father's refusal to intervene, to clarify, or even to acknowledge the magnitude of what had been lost, gnawed at him. How could the king remain silent while his sister and his wife tore each other apart? That silence, to William, was complicity. It suggested that the king either feared the truth or wished it to remain hidden. For a son who had watched his mother's truth suppressed in life and her voice sanitized in death, the parallel was unbearable. As tensions mounted, the younger generation began to see this as their battle too. This was not just about Anne, Camilla, or even Charles. It was about whether the monarchy that George, Charlotte, and Louis would inherit would be built on truth or on shadows. The storm had reached beyond the present, pulling the children of tomorrow into its violent center. But the silence of one figure spoke louder than all the king himself, caught in the storm between his sister and his wife. All eyes turned to King Charles. Would he defend his wife, or stand beside the sister who had been his shield since childhood? The moment Anne confronted Camilla over the missing documents, all roads led back to him. For Charles, the confrontation was more than a clash between two women. It was a direct challenge to his authority, his judgment, and his ability to lead a fractured monarchy. What unfolded left him blindsided, caught between the fire of loyalty to blood and the chains of duty to the woman who now bore the crown beside him. In private, his anguish ran deep. Anne had always been his anchor, the sibling who understood his burdens when few others did. Her blunt honesty and unwavering loyalty had shielded him countless times from both family tensions and public scrutiny. Yet Camilla had been his chosen partner, the woman for whom he had sacrificed reputation, endured scorn, and ultimately secured acceptance within the palace walls. Now, these two forces stood in direct opposition, pulling him apart in ways no crown could reconcile. His silence was not indifference but torment, a torment that left the monarchy itself wavering in uncertainty. Behind closed doors, whispers began to grow louder. Charles may have once seen the very documents Anne accused Camilla of concealing. Advisors murmured that he had glimpsed them years ago, tucked within Windsor's guarded files, and knew their explosive potential. If that were true, his inaction carried the weight of complicity. To admit knowledge now would be to admit he had allowed the disappearance, if not outright approved it. The king's indecision, his refusal to address the whispers, became as damning as guilt. Meanwhile, pressure mounted from those around him. Advisors and courtiers demanded clarity, urging him to step forward, to address the scandal before it consumed the monarchy whole. But Charles hesitated. Every word he might speak carried risk. To defend Camilla was to condemn Anne, and to side with Anne was to weaken the woman at his side, potentially unraveling years of fragile acceptance. Each option threatened to fracture the crown further, exposing the cracks that Elizabeth had worked her entire life to seal. What haunted him most was the fear that exposure could undo everything. If the missing documents emerged, if their contents were laid bare, the monarchy could suffer irreparable damage. Financial dealings tied to Camilla's family, decrees hinting at Catherine's ascendancy, succession debates that cast doubt on the present line, all could shatter the trust of a nation already wavering in its faith. Charles knew that once trust was gone, the crown was nothing more than a hollow ornament resting on a trembling head. And yet, his silence only deepened the suspicion. To those watching, his hesitation was weakness. To his subjects, it made the monarchy appear fractured, divided against itself, and incapable of upholding the very truths it claimed to embody. To his children, it was another painful reminder of a father too paralyzed by fear to defend either family or legacy. The king's silence became the loudest voice in the palace, echoing through corridors already heavy with betrayal. As the king faltered, Anne prepared for the final blow, revealing what she believed Camilla had done with the crown's secrets. With steel in her voice, Anne delivered her final claim, that Camilla not only hid the documents, but destroyed them to erase her own vulnerabilities. The accusation fell like a thunderclap, silencing the room and cutting through the fragile restraint that had barely held the family together. No longer was this a matter of misplacement, oversight, or clerical error. Anne spoke of deliberate destruction of boxes of history, deliberately carried into the shadows and fed to flames. Her voice carried not just anger but certainty, as if every syllable struck with the weight of proof. Those who heard it later recalled the moment as nothing short of incendiary. Anne claimed that entire boxes of papers had been deliberately burned, their ashes scattered, as if to erase not only the records, but the very possibility of accountability. Among those documents, she insisted, were files that could have tied Camilla's family to questionable financial dealings, evidence of entanglements with royal funds, papers that could expose a web of influence woven into the monarchy's guarded walls. To Anne, this was not simply dishonesty. It was an act of treachery, one that attempted to rewrite history by obliterating it. The revelation was described by aides as a nuclear moment inside Windsor. The atmosphere fractured instantly. For Camilla, the accusations were unbearable, her composure breaking under the sheer force of Anne's words. Tears welled in her eyes as she denied wrongdoing, yet her refusal to address the details only deepened suspicion. She could not explain the whispers of missing files. She could not account for the movements of her staff. Her tears, whether genuine grief or desperate deflection, did nothing to quiet the roar of speculation now burning through the palace. The room itself seemed to divide. Some looked upon Anne with admiration, seeing in her the unflinching protector of her mother's memory and the monarchy's spine. Others whispered of cruelty, of a sister unleashing destruction upon her brother's fragile reign. Loyalty and betrayal blurred, until neither could be separated from the other. Every word Anne spoke drew new lines of allegiance, and every silence from Charles fanned the flames higher. But Anne did not falter. Her voice did not soften. If the monarchy itself needed to be dragged through fire to reveal the truth, then so be it. She vowed that if the palace would not hold Camilla accountable, she would take her revelation beyond Windsor's walls. She would expose it to the nation, to the very people whose trust in the monarchy was already wavering. It was not a threat spoken in haste, but a promise delivered with the force of destiny. But the storm Anne unleashed was not one she could contain. Its aftershocks would shake every corner of the monarchy. What followed was nothing short of catastrophic. The monarchy, already fragile, now faced the risk of crumbling from within, and the missing documents became the weapon everyone feared. Whispers of a cover-up spread beyond palace gates, carried into the public sphere through carefully leaked details that hinted at Windsor's darkest secrets. Suddenly, the institution that had survived wars, abdications, and scandals was once again under siege, this time from within its own blood. The media seized the story with ferocity, fueling a firestorm of distrust. Questions multiplied faster than the palace could suppress them. Why were the documents hidden? Who allowed them to disappear? And most damning of all, what truths had been destroyed before the world ever had a chance to see them? Every unanswered question became an accusation. Every silence, a verdict. Behind closed doors, Catherine moved quietly, determined to preserve what she could. She began safeguarding Diana's remaining letters, keeping them beyond the reach of those who might bury them in the same way. To her, the survival of truth was no longer an abstract duty. It was her children's inheritance. William, consumed by anger at his father's silence, gave a chilling warning. If truth dies, so does the crown. His words echoed the fear of an entire nation. Spoken not as a prince, but as a son who had seen his mother's truth erased once before. Meanwhile, Charles's health faltered under the crushing weight of division. His reign, already unsteady, seemed to buckle with each passing day of unanswered scandal. And yet, amid the chaos, Anne stood unbroken. She had lit the fire and refused to step back from its blaze. But even she could not silence the haunting question. Had she saved the monarchy by exposing its secrets, or had she doomed it by tearing open wounds that could never heal? And so, the confrontation over missing royal documents became more than history. It became the spark of a royal reckoning the world will never forget. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.